Night arrives not as an ending, but as a doorway. When the world grows quiet and the noise of expectation finally loosens its grip, something ancient within you begins to stir. This is the hour when masks fall away, when the tired roles you perform all day, the struggler, the pleaser, the survivor, lie down beside you and grow still. And in that stillness, your mind listens differently. You were never meant to battle your life awake and exhausted. You were never meant to chase abundance with clenched fists and shallow breath. The greatest shifts in human destiny have always occurred in silence, when effort surrendered to understanding and resistance softened into trust. While you sleep, the conscious guard lowers. The mind becomes receptive, vulnerable, fertile. This is where old instructions loosen and new ones take root. Most people sleep to escape the day. Few realize sleep is where the day can be rewritten, not by force, not by wishing, but by allowing a deeper intelligence, the one that has carried you through every storm, to speak uninterrupted. The same mind that learned fear can learn freedom. The same mind that memorized lack can remember abundance. Tonight is not about dreaming of a different life. It is about preparing yourself to wake up as someone different, someone aligned, someone quietly certain, someone no longer arguing with their own potential. Watch till the end. Hit subscribe and remember, the real change begins now. The night does not announce itself. It arrives quietly, almost apologetically, as if it knows you've already carried too much. The lights dim. The world loosens its grip, and there you are, finally alone with the one thing you've been avoiding all day, your own mind. No distractions left to negotiate with, no performance left to maintain. Just silence, and beneath that silence, a low hum of thoughts you didn't choose but somehow learned to live with. This is where the real work has always been happening, not in the hours when you are visible, productive, admired, or exhausted, but here, when your body surrenders and your defenses go soft. When the mask slips without your permission, when the mind unguarded begins speaking in its native tongue. You think sleep is rest, but sleep is a negotiation, and every night without fail your mind returns to the same question: what is true about you? You may not hear it clearly. It doesn't shout, it doesn't argue. It repeats, quietly, patiently, the same beliefs you absorbed before you had language, the same conclusions you reached during moments of shame, loss, or disappointment. This is where the loudest outcomes of your life are rehearsed, not with drama, but with consistency. And consistency is more powerful than intention. You wake up every morning believing the day ahead is shaped by what you do, but the truth is harder to face. The day is shaped by what you accepted the night before, by what your mind repeated while you were too tired to interrupt it, by the agreements you've made in silence and never thought to renegotiate. Think about how many times you've woken up already defeated, without knowing why. No argument, no event, just a heaviness you couldn't explain. That weight didn't appear in the morning. It was formed slowly, in the hours when you were still, when your mind returns to familiar stories because familiarity feels safer than change, even when it hurts. The silent hours do not care about your goals. They care about your identity. They are not interested in what you want. They are loyal to what you believe. And belief is not what you say out loud when you're hopeful. Belief is what your mind defaults to when no one is watching. This is why effort alone has never been enough. You've tried harder before. You've pushed, disciplined, motivated yourself through sheer force. And still, something invisible kept pulling you back. Not because you were weak, but because you were rehearsing the same inner script every night, then wondering why the same scenes kept playing out in daylight. The mind does not rest when the body sleeps. It organizes, it sorts, it reinforces, it asks again and again, who are you allowed to be? Analyzing interrupted, it answers with yesterday's conclusions, not because they're true, but because they're familiar. You didn't choose most of those conclusions. They were handed to you in moments when you were vulnerable, when someone spoke over you, when you failed and decided that failure meant something permanent, when you watched others succeed and quietly placed yourself outside the story. Those moments didn't scream, they whispered, and whispers, repeated often enough, become law. The tragedy is not that these beliefs exist. The tragedy is that they go unchallenged. Night after night, the mind repeats them like a faithful servant, assuming silence means consent. And every morning you wake up inside a reality that feels solid, inevitable, just the way things are. But it was built in the dark, one quiet agreement at a time. Here is the turning point most people never reach, realizing that stillness is not passive. Stillness is where direction is set. When the world stops demanding from you, your inner voice steps forward to fill the space. And if that voice is shaped by fear, scarcity, or resignation, it will guide you faithfully, straight back to the life you've been trying to escape. But this is also where your power has been waiting, because the same silent hours that reinforce the limitation can also dissolve it. The mind does not resist change when it feels safe. And safety is not found in noise. It's found in quiet attention, in noticing what thoughts arrive when nothing is competing for your awareness, in hearing the old agreements without fighting them, and finally realizing they are not laws, they are habits. Transformation does not begin with confrontation. It begins with recognition, with the moment you stop numbing yourself into sleep and start listening, not to judge, not to fix immediately, just to hear what your mind has been repeating on your behalf. Awareness is not dramatic, but it is disruptive. The moment you see a pattern clearly, it begins to loosen. You start to understand that your life hasn't been sabotaged by chance or cruelty alone. It has been shaped by what was rehearsed in private. And that understanding is not meant to shame you. It is meant to return responsibility to where it belongs, not in your actions, but in your acceptance. The silent hours are honest. They don't flatter you. But they also don't lie. They show you exactly what you've been living from. And once you see that, you are no longer a victim of it. You become a participant. This is where something subtle but irreversible begins. You stop treating rest as escape. You stop letting your mind wander unattended into old territory. You begin to approach stillness with intention, not force, not struggle, but presence. You recognize that what you allow your mind to linger on at night becomes the lens through which you interpret the world in the morning. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, the tone changes. Not overnight, not with fireworks, but with a quiet shift in what feels familiar. New thoughts don't feel foreign anymore. Old fears don't feel authoritative. You start waking up with less resistance, not because life got easier, but because your inner negotiations changed. The loudest outcomes of your life were never created by single decisions. They were shaped by repeated inner consent, and consent can be withdrawn. When you finally understand this, the night stops being something you survive. It becomes something you respect, a sacred interval where identity is either reinforced or rewritten. And you realize with a kind of calm certainty that the future you've been waiting for is not built in daylight effort alone. It is born in the quiet moments when you choose, consciously, what your mind is allowed to carry forward. Nothing about this is rushed. Nothing about it is loud. But once it begins, it does not reverse, because you have seen where your life truly takes shape, and you will never again underestimate the power of what you accept in silence. There is a moment, usually late, usually quiet, when you realize the noise has stopped, but something inside you hasn't. No voices, no screens, no demands pulling at your attention. And yet beneath the stillness there is movement, a subtle current, a sense that something is paying attention even when you are not. That feeling is not imagined. It is recognition. Your subconscious has been listening long before you learned to speak. You were taught to believe that silence means nothing is happening, that rest is empty, that if you are not consciously thinking, nothing is being decided. But the truth is far more intimate and far more consequential. The deepest part of your mind does not sleep. It does not debate. It does not argue or evaluate. It listens, constantly, faithfully, and whatever it hears often enough, it accepts as instruction. This is where most lives quietly turn without ceremony. Think back to the first time you doubted yourself. Not the dramatic moments, the quieter ones. The passing comment, the look that lingered too long, the disappointment you didn't know how to process, so you turned it inward. You didn't announce a decision that day, you didn't declare a belief, but something registered, something noted the tone, and from that moment on, the subconscious kept listening for confirmation. It does not ask whether a thought is fair. It does not question whether a conclusion is temporary. It records the emotional weight behind it and stores it as truth, not because it is cruel, but because it is loyal. Its only function is to protect continuity, to make tomorrow feel familiar, even if familiar hurts. This is why you can say all the right things out loud and still feel stuck. Why can you intellectually understand your worth and emotionally feel undeserving. The subconscious does not respond to explanation. It responds to repetition and feeling. What you casually think when you're tired, what you assume when things go wrong, what you mutter to yourself in moments of frustration, that is the real language it hears. And it hears everything, every unchallenged self-criticism, every quiet expectation of disappointment, every time you brace yourself for less so it won't hurt as much. None of that disappears. It settles, it accumulates, and slowly it becomes the lens through which you interpret the world. You begin to see patterns that aren't patterns. They're echoes. You attract confirmation not because the world is conspiring against you, but because your inner recorder has been trained to recognize certain outcomes as normal. The subconscious does not create circumstances out of malice. It creates coherence. It aligns your behavior, perception, and choices with what it has been taught to expect. This is where the pain deepens for many people because they feel betrayed by their own minds, as if some hidden part of them is working against their conscious desires. But that part is not your enemy. It is your most obedient ally. It has simply been following instructions you didn't realize you were giving. Awareness changes everything here. The moment you realize your subconscious is always listening, you stop speaking carelessly in your own presence, not with fear, but with respect. You begin to notice the tone of your inner dialogue, not just the words, but the emotion behind them. You see how often you narrate your life as a series of near misses, compromises, or quiet defeats. And for the first time, you understand why change has felt temporary. You weren't failing. You were being consistent. The subconscious learns through the atmosphere, through mood, through what feels true in the body, not what sounds convincing in the mind. This is why moments of heightened emotion, stress, exhaustion, disappointment are so influential. In those moments, the conscious guard is lowered, the recorder is wide open, and whatever story you tell yourself then carries more weight than 1,000 affirmations spoken without feeling. This realization can be unsettling. It means you are more responsible than you thought, but it also means you are more powerful. Because if the subconscious absorbs instruction without judgment, it can absorb new instruction just as faithfully. It does not cling to the past out of loyalty to pain. It clings to repetition, to familiarity, to emotional certainty. Change the input consistently and the recorder adjusts. But this is not about forcing positive thoughts or policing your mind. That only creates resistance. The subconscious does not respond to pressure. It responds to coherence, to alignment between what you feel and what you repeat. To be honest, it was delivered gently, consistently, and without drama. It begins with listening to yourself the way your subconscious has been listening all along. You notice how often you speak to yourself in absolutes, how quickly one mistake becomes an identity, how often you predict failure before effort has a chance to breathe. And instead of fighting those thoughts, you pause, you let them finish. And then you recognize them for what they are, recordings from an earlier chapter, still playing, because no one changed the tape. This is the shift. Not a declaration, not a breakthrough moment that looks impressive from the outside, but a quiet decision to stop feeding the same conclusions into the same attentive listener. You become more deliberate with what you dwell on in moments of vulnerability. You stop rehearsing worst-case scenarios as a form of self-protection. You begin to sit with uncertainty without immediately labeling it as danger. These are not dramatic acts, but they are radical to the subconscious because they interrupt expectation. Over time, something inside you recalibrates. The familiar heaviness loses its authority. New interpretations don't feel forced anymore. You catch yourself responding differently before you realize you've changed, not because you tried harder, but because the inner environment shifted. The subconscious doesn't announce this shift. It simply stops insisting on the old story. And when that happens, the world begins to feel subtly different. Opportunities don't look like traps. Effort doesn't feel like self-betrayal. You don't brace yourself as often. You don't need to. This is the quiet thunder most people never hear, the sound of an inner agreement dissolving. You realize that the voice you've been living under was never a prophecy. It was a recording. And recordings can be replaced. The most profound transformations are not loud. They are not performative. They happen when you understand that someone inside you has been listening patiently your entire life, and you finally choose to speak with intention, awareness, and respect, not to impress that listener, but to guide it. And once you do, the mind that once replayed limitations with perfect loyalty begins just as faithfully to rehearse a different reality, not because you demanded it, but because you taught it what to listen for. That is the moment everything quietly changes. The first time you felt scarcity, it didn't arrive as fear. It arrived as normal, a quiet understanding in your chest that certain things were not meant for you, that wanting too much was dangerous, that asking for more came with consequences. You didn't argue with that understanding. You absorbed it, because it wasn't presented as a belief. It was presented as reality. You learned scarcity the same way you learned gravity, through observation, through repetition, through watching the adults around you tighten their shoulders when money was mentioned, through hearing conversations trail off into silence, through sensing tension where there should have been ease. No one sat you down and taught you lack. They lived it, and you learned it fluently. This is where the pain hides, not in what you were denied, but in what you normalized. You grew up thinking struggle was proof of character. That ease was suspicious. That abundance belonged to someone else's world, someone else's rules, someone else's last name. You didn't consciously reject the possibility. You just stopped expecting it. And over time, expectation hardened into identity. You told yourself you were being realistic, responsible, grounded. But realism became a cage when it was built from borrowed fear. You learned to want less, not because less fulfilled you, but because wanting more once felt unsafe. Because disappointment leaves scars when it comes early and often. Scarcity is rarely loud. It doesn't announce itself as hopelessness. It disguises itself as caution, as humility, as this is just how things are. And that disguise makes it powerful, because it doesn't feel like something to fight. It feels like something to accept. But here is the truth that changes everything. Scarcity was learned, and anything learned can be unlearned. This doesn't mean your past wasn't real. It doesn't mean the limitations you witnessed didn't exist. It means they were conditions, not conclusions. Responses to circumstances, not instructions for your future. Somewhere along the way, survival strategies were mistaken for universal laws, and you inherited them without questioning whether they still served you. You feel this inheritance in subtle ways, in how quickly you calculate risk before allowing yourself to feel desire, in how you downplay your ambitions so they won't expose you, in how you hesitate to receive praise, help, opportunity, as if taking too much might upset an invisible balance. This isn't a weakness, it's conditioning. The mind seeks continuity above all else, and when scarcity is familiar, abundance feels like disruption. Even when you say you want more, a deeper part of you braces for loss. You expect the ground to disappear the moment things improve. So you hold back, you manage expectations. You keep one foot in disappointment, just in case. This is the quiet tragedy of inherited limitation. It convinces you that restraint is wisdom, when often it is fear wearing a reasonable face. But patterns are not destinies. They persist only as long as they go unquestioned. The moment you begin to see scarcity as something you learned, not something you are, space opens. Not immediately, but unmistakably. Space between you and the old reflexes. Space between stimulus and response. Space where choice can exist. You start noticing how often you anticipate loss instead of possibility. How your mind scans for what might go wrong even in moments that are going right. And instead of shaming yourself for it, you recognize it as an old survival reflex, doing its job too well. That recognition softens something. You realize you don't need to fight scarcity head on. You don't need to declare yourself abundant or pretend fear isn't there. You simply need to stop treating inherited caution as eternal truth, to question the voice that says, this is as good as it gets, and ask gently but firmly, according to whom? This is where the unlearning begins. Not with rebellion, but with discernment. You begin to separate your lived experience from the experiences that shaped you. You honor where they came from without letting them dictate where you're going. You understand that the people who taught you scarcity were not malicious. They were managing their own wounds. And you don't have to carry those wounds forward to remain loyal. Loyalty does not require repetition. As this understanding deepens, something unexpected happens. You start to feel discomfort, not when things go wrong, but when they go right. And instead of pulling back, you stay. You let the discomfort pass. You allow yourself to receive without apology, not because it's easy, but because you're tired of shrinking to stay safe. This is the quiet courage most people never practice. You begin to form a new internal agreement, one that doesn't deny uncertainty, but refuses to let uncertainty dictate your worth. One that understands abundance is not about excess, it's about permission. Permission to expect support. Permission to believe effort can be met with reward. Permission to imagine a future that is not a repetition of the past. This agreement doesn't feel explosive. It feels steady, grounded, almost ordinary. And that's how you know it's real. You stop measuring yourself against inherited ceilings. You stop apologizing for wanting a life that feels expansive instead of merely survivable. You don't abandon responsibility. You redefine it. Responsibility to your potential. Responsibility to not pass on the same quiet limitations you once absorbed without consent. And slowly, the world responds differently. Not because it changed, but because you did. You notice opportunities you would have dismissed before. You take up space in conversations without rehearsing your exit. You make decisions based on alignment rather than fear of loss. None of this feels dramatic. It feels overdue. The storm here is internal, and it builds not from anger, but from clarity. You realize scarcity was never a verdict. It was a chapter, and chapters end when the lesson is learned. The most powerful moment comes quietly, when you see that you no longer flinch at possibility, that you no longer need to justify wanting more, that you can hold hope without bracing for impact. In that moment, something ancient loosens its grip. You understand, with a calm that doesn't need proof, that lack was never your inheritance. It was a temporary language you learned to survive, and now, deliberately, patiently, you are learning a new one. The moment you close your eyes, the world assumes you've disappeared, that you stepped away, that nothing of consequence is happening anymore, but inside you something remains alert, not tense, not effortful, just present. Like a room with the lights off where someone is still awake, listening. This is not absence, this is a transition. You were taught to treat sleep as retreat, as collapse, as a place to shut down after enduring the day. And because of that, you never noticed what was quietly shaping you there. You never realized that while your body was resting, your inner world was being instructed, not aggressively, not dramatically, but thoroughly. Sleep has never been an escape. It has always been a classroom. Most of your life was not shaped by moments of effort. It was shaped by moments of absorption, by what entered you when you were open, when you were tired, when your guard was down. And nowhere is the guard lower than in the hours between waking and dreaming. This is where the pain begins to surface, because you spend years trying to fix your life while ignoring the place where it keeps being reinforced. You wake up feeling behind without knowing why, heavy without a clear reason. You carry moods that don't belong to the present moment. You react to the day as if it's already proven something you haven't yet seen. That tone didn't come from nowhere. It was set before the day began. It was rehearsed in the dark. Sleep strips you of performance, of explanation, of control. It takes away the version of you that negotiates with the world and leaves behind the version that listens. And what you expose yourself to in that state matters more than you were ever told, because the mind, when relaxed, is teachable. You assume learning requires effort, attention, and struggle, but the deepest learning happens when resistance is absent, when the mind is no longer trying to protect an identity, when it's not defending old conclusions. In sleep, the mind is not arguing, it's receiving. This is why the same emotional patterns keep returning even when you swear you're done with them. Why can you consciously decide to change and still wake up inside the same reactions? You didn't fail during the day. You were instructed at night, not intentionally, not maliciously, but consistently. You fell asleep to worry and taught your mind that uncertainty is dangerous. You fell asleep replaying regret and taught it that the past is unfinished business. You fell asleep numb and taught it that feeling deeply is unsafe. None of this was chosen, but all of it was absorbed. And the mind is a diligent student. The tragedy is not that sleep teaches. The tragedy is that no one told you it does. So you treated it casually. You let the final moments of your day be filled with noise, distraction, unresolved tension. You let your mind drift wherever it wanted, assuming it didn't matter because you'd be unconscious soon anyway. But unconsciousness is not emptiness. It is open. Here is where the shift begins. When you stop trying to escape into sleep and start entering it. Entering does not mean controlling. It means respect. It means understanding that the last emotional tone you carry into rest becomes the first lens through which you meet the world again. that what you expose your mind to in that softened state doesn't fade, it settles. This realization can feel uncomfortable because it removes an excuse. It shows you that rest is not neutral, that stillness is not passive, that even in surrender you are participating in who you are becoming. But it also returns something priceless to you, influence. You begin to notice how different nights create different mornings, how certain thoughts, when carried into sleep, echo for days, how calm entered deliberately feels different from calm achieved accidentally. And you start to understand that sleep is not something that happens to, it's something you move through. This is not about rituals or techniques, it's about awareness, about asking yourself quietly what state you are handing your mind over in, whether you are sending it into rest clenched or open, resigned or receptive, whether you are closing the day in judgment or in understanding. When you begin to treat sleep as a classroom, you stop flooding it with chaos. You don't demand perfection. You offer intention. You let the day end without dragging every unresolved moment into the dark. You choose to release instead of rehearse. And this is where the storm begins to build, slowly, internally, because the mind, when consistently met with clarity instead of confusion, reorganizes itself. It stops clinging to unnecessary alarms. It stops looping old fears simply to stay occupied. It starts making space. You wake up and something is different. Not your circumstances, your posture toward them. You're less reactive, less braced. You feel like you've already arrived somewhere before the day even starts. That feeling isn't confidence. It's alignment. This is how deep change actually happens, not through dramatic breakthroughs, but through quiet instruction repeated without resistance. Sleep becomes the place where your identity is no longer defended, and therefore no longer fixed, where the mind is free to update its assumptions, where you can stop reliving the same emotional syllabus and begin learning something new. You don't force this process. You respect it, and one night without ceremony, you realize you are no longer using rest to disappear. You are using it to integrate, to prepare, to realign with who you are becoming instead of who you were taught to be. That is the quiet thunder, the understanding that the most powerful classroom you will ever enter does not require effort, struggle, or approval. Only presence, only care, only the decision to stop abandoning your inner world when it is most receptive. You no longer fall asleep running from the day. You enter sleep as someone who knows they are still being shaped. And finally, deliberately, you choose how. At first it feels harmless, almost invisible. A thought you've had 1,000 times before, passing through your mind like background noise. You don't stop it. You don't argue with it. You barely notice it. And that's exactly why it stays. Because repetition does not need intensity to be powerful. It needs permission. You've been taught to believe that who you are is defined by your biggest decisions, the bold moves, the dramatic moments, the turning points you can name. But identity is rarely shaped that way. Identity is shaped quietly through what you return to again and again, through the thoughts you rehearse when nothing demands your attention, through the inner phrases that feel so familiar you mistake them for truth. This is where the weight begins to press in, because you start to realize how much of yourself was not chosen but practiced. You didn't wake up one day and decide to doubt yourself. You repeated doubt until it became a reflex. You didn't consciously decide to feel unworthy of ease or success. You simply revisited the same conclusions so often that they hardened into a sense of this is just me, and over time, repetition stopped sounding like thought and started sounding like identity. The mind does not ask whether a thought is accurate. It asks whether it is consistent. Whatever you repeat becomes familiar. Whatever becomes familiar becomes comfortable, and whatever feels comfortable becomes home. Even when it limits you, this is why change feels threatening, even when it's positive, because it interrupts the rhythm you've been living by. You feel this tension every time you try to step beyond yourself, a subtle pull backward, a voice that says, this isn't you, not angrily, calmly, convincingly. That voice isn't wisdom. It's repetition defending its territory. Your mind is loyal to what you've practiced being, and this is the hard truth most people never face. You don't live in your circumstances. You live in your patterns. Circumstances change. Patterns persist. And patterns are built through repetition so small it feels insignificant in the moment. Think about the stories you tell yourself without realizing it. The way you narrate effort is draining before it begins. The way you expect resistance, assume delay, prepare for disappointment. None of that required a traumatic event. It required repetition, a quiet agreement renewed daily. This is why willpower alone collapses. You try to act like someone you have not rehearsed being, and the mind resists, not because it hates growth, but because it protects coherence. It wants your actions to match the identity it knows. But identity is not fixed, it is reinforced, and anything reinforced can be rewritten. The shift begins when you stop chasing dramatic change and start paying attention to what you allow yourself to repeat, not out loud, internally, emotionally. Subtly, you begin to notice how often you return to the same interpretations, how quickly one obstacle confirms an old belief, how effortlessly your mind supplies the same explanations for why things are hard, slow, or just out of reach. This notice is uncomfortable because it removes the illusion that you are trapped by fate alone. It shows you that much of what feels inevitable has been rehearsed. But it also opens a door, because if repetition builds this version of you, repetition can build another. Not through force, not through pretending, through consistency that feels almost boring in its simplicity, through choosing again and again not the loudest thought, but the truest one you can sustain, through interrupting old loops not with argument, but with replacement. You don't fight the old identity, you outgrow it. This is where patience becomes power, because the mind does not change overnight. It changes through exposure, through being gently but persistently introduced to a different narrative until that narrative stops feeling foreign. You start repeating a new interpretation, not because it's comfortable, but because it's honest. You don't deny difficulty. You stop using it as proof of limitation. You don't inflate yourself. You stop shrinking. At first, it feels artificial, like wearing clothes that don't fit yet. The old voice returns often, reminding you of who you've always been. And this is the test. Not whether you silence it, but whether you continue anyway. Because repetition does not work through intensity. It works through endurance. You repeat the new thought when it hasn't paid off yet. You repeat it when results are slow. You repeat it when no one is watching and no reward is immediate. And slowly, something subtle shifts. The old voice loses speed. The new one stops needing effort. You catch yourself responding differently without planning to. You notice you no longer spiral as deeply. You realize your internal reactions are changing before your external world does. And that's when you understand. Identity is updating. This is not a performance. It's a recalibration. You are no longer trying to convince yourself of something grand. You are allowing yourself to become familiar with a different way of being. And familiarity is the gateway to belief. The most dangerous lie you ever repeated was that this is just how you are, that your limits were personality, that your hesitation was wisdom, that your fear was realism. Those were not truths, they were habits. And habits do not argue when they are replaced, they fade. One day you notice the old narrative doesn't arrive as quickly. When it does, it doesn't land as heavily. You don't feel the need to obey it. And at that moment there were no fireworks, just clarity. You see that you are not betraying your past by changing. You are honoring it by no longer being confined by it. This is the quiet breakthrough, the realization that you were never waiting for permission to become someone else. You were waiting for repetition to do its work, and now it is. You understand, deeply and without needing to explain it to anyone, that identity is not discovered. It is rehearsed, and you have begun rehearsing differently. Not perfectly, not loudly, but consistently. And consistency over time becomes destiny. Before a thought ever convinced you, something else moved first. A tightening in your chest, a heaviness behind your eyes, a quiet rush of relief, or a familiar drop of dread. You didn't choose that feeling, it arrived. And before you could name it, your mind had already followed its lead. This is where most people misunderstand themselves. They think their lives are shaped by what they think. But long before thought takes the wheel, emotion has already decided the direction. You felt this your entire life. You just weren't taught to notice it. You can explain a belief logically and still feel unmoved. You can understand the truth and still live as if it isn't real, because the mind does not obey words. It obeys emotion, and whoever emotion carries the most weight becomes the authority. This is where the struggle deepens, because you try to reason your way out of patterns that were never created by reason in the first place. You tell yourself you're capable, but the feeling underneath says otherwise. You say you're ready, but your body tightens as if danger is near. You plan for change, yet a quiet discomfort pulls you back toward what's familiar. That pull is not a weakness, it's an emotional memory. Your mind has been trained to associate certain feelings with safety and others with risk. And it will always choose what feels safe, even if that safety is small, limiting, or painful. This is why fear can overpower intention, why doubt can cancel effort, why excitement can move you faster than discipline ever could. Emotion speaks first, thought justifies afterward. Think about the beliefs that have lasted the longest in your life, the ones that shaped your choices without debate. They didn't arrive as ideas, they arrived as experiences, moments where emotion burned something into you deeply enough that it never needed explanation again, a failure that carried shame, a success that carried relief, a loss that carried meaning you never questioned. Your subconscious didn't record the details, it recorded the feeling, and from that moment on, it treated that feeling as instruction. This is where change begins to feel impossible, because you're trying to rewrite instructions in a language the mind doesn't prioritize. But here is the truth that shifts the ground beneath you. Emotion is not the enemy, it is the gateway. The mind does not reject change because it hates growth. It rejects change when the emotional signal says, this is unsafe, and safety, to the subconscious, has nothing to do with logic. It has everything to do with familiarity. This is why even positive change can feel threatening, why peace can feel boring, why abundance can feel suspicious. Your mind isn't sabotaging you. It's protecting an emotional baseline it learned long ago, and that baseline was set during moments you didn't fully process. Times when you swallowed disappointment instead of feeling it, when you numbed instead of grieving, when you moved on quickly because stopping felt dangerous. Those unprocessed emotions didn't disappear, they stayed active, quietly guiding your reactions. This is the pain most people carry without words. Not trauma they can name, but emotional instructions they never examined. You feel it when your body reacts before your mind catches up, when your heart closes before you've decided to, when you pull away from opportunity not because it's wrong, but because it feels unfamiliar. This is not failure. It's fluency in the language you were never taught you were speaking. And once you understand that emotion is the language the mind obeys, everything changes. You stop trying to overpower feelings with thoughts. You stop arguing with yourself. You stop shaming your reactions. Instead, you begin listening. You ask what the emotion is protecting, what it learned, what it believes is at stake. And in doing so, you remove its need to shout. Because emotions don't need to be eliminated. They need to be understood. When you feel fear, it's not because you're incapable. It's because some part of you learned that visibility had consequences. When you feel resistance, it's not because you're lazy. It's because effort once led to disappointment. When you feel unworthy, it's not because it's true. It's because worth was once conditional. These emotions are not random. They are messengers carrying outdated instructions. And the mind obeys them because it assumes they are still relevant. This is where transformation actually begins. Not with changing what you think, but with changing how you feel while thinking it. You begin to introduce new emotional experiences gently, not forcing confidence, but allowing small moments of safety while expanding, not demanding certainty, but building trust through consistency. You let the body learn what the mind cannot explain. This is slow work, quiet work, work that doesn't look impressive from the outside, but it's the only kind that lasts. You notice when your nervous system relaxes instead of tightens, when curiosity replaces fear, when hope doesn't feel reckless anymore. These are not moods, they are signals, and the subconscious listens closely to them. Over time, emotion stops contradicting your intentions, it begins to support them. This is when alignment happens, not because you've mastered your thoughts, but because your inner world is no longer sending mixed messages. The mind stops resisting because the emotional language has changed. You feel grounded where you once felt guarded. You feel open where you once felt grazed. You feel capable without needing to prove it. And the most powerful shift of all occurs quietly. You stop being afraid of your emotions. You no longer treat fear as an obstacle. You treat it as information. You no longer suppress discomfort. You stay with it long enough to understand what it's trying to preserve. And in doing so, you reclaim authority. The mind doesn't need to be dominated. It needs to feel safe enough to evolve. And safety is emotional. This is the realization that breaks old cycles. The understanding that lasting change is not a battle of thoughts, but a recalibration of feeling. That when emotion and intention move in the same direction, effort becomes natural. You are no longer trying to convince yourself of who you could be. You are allowing yourself to feel it. And once the feeling changes, the mind follows without resistance. That is the quiet storm. The moment you realize you don't need to fight yourself to grow, you need to speak the language your mind has always obeyed. And now, finally, you are fluent. You spent years believing abundance was something outside of you, something distant, something selective. You watched it land in other people's lives and assumed it moved by luck, timing, or favor you hadn't earned yet. And quietly, without realizing it, you placed abundance on a pedestal, high enough to admire, far enough to never touch. That distance is where the ache lives, because chasing abundance feels like chasing approval. No matter how hard you work, how disciplined you become, how much you improve yourself, it always seems to stay one step ahead, just out of reach. And over time, pursuit turns into exhaustion. Hope turns into strain. Desire turns into resentment you don't want to admit. This is where the misunderstanding begins. You were never meant to attract abundance the way you attract attention. Abundance is not persuaded. I am not convinced. I am not impressed by effort alone. Abundance responds to alignment. And alignment is internal before it is ever external. You feel the misalignment every time you want more, but brace for disappointment. Every time you visualize success, but emotionally prepare for loss. Every time you say you're ready while your body tightens as if something dangerous is approaching. That tension is not ambition. It is resistance. And a resistance cannot receive what it is busy guarding against. You've been taught that wanting more means pushing harder, reaching further, hustling longer. But effort without alignment only amplifies contradiction. You can work endlessly and still repel what you're working toward if your inner world is saying, "This doesn't belong to me." This is the painful truth few people face. You don't repel abundance because you're undeserving. You repel it because it conflicts with the identity you're currently living from. Abundance does not enter environments where it must argue for permission. Think about the moments you felt most alive, most capable, most clear. Not when you were forcing outcomes, but when something clicked internally. When your actions felt natural. When effort didn't feel like self-betrayal. In those moments, things moved. Doors opened, support appeared. Not because you chased harder, but because you stopped resisting who you were becoming. Alignment feels like coherence, like your thoughts, emotions, and actions are no longer pulling in opposite directions. And when that coherence exists, abundance doesn't need to be summoned. It recognizes itself. This is where the old model collapses. You were taught to believe abundance arrives after proof, after struggling, after suffering long enough to earn it. But abundance is not a reward system. It is a response system. It responds to the internal environment you maintain consistently, not the performance you display occasionally. You can feel the difference between wanting and aligning. Wanting feels restless, tight, anxious, like you're reaching from emptiness. Alignment feels grounded, calm, certain without being loud, like you're standing where you belong and allowing the world to respond accordingly. This doesn't mean you stop acting. It means your actions stop contradicting your inner state. You stop asking, "How do I get more?" And you start asking, "Who am I being while I'm asking?" Because abundance does not match desire, it matches identity. If you see yourself as someone who survives, abundance feels threatening. If you see yourself as someone who struggles, ease feels suspicious. If you see yourself as someone who must prove worth, receiving feels uncomfortable. And the subconscious will always choose emotional safety over external gain. This is why so many people sabotage opportunity right after it appears. Not consciously, emotionally. They weren't aligned with receiving yet. Their self-image hadn't caught up with the possibility. Alignment requires honesty, not positivity. You stop pretending to be confident. You stop forcing belief. Instead, you notice where you're out of sync, where you say one thing but feel another. Where you pursue outcomes your nervous system doesn't yet trust. And rather than pushing through that disconnect, you work within it. You allow yourself to become familiar with more ease without guilt, more support without suspicion, more possibility without bracing for loss. This is not fantasy. This is conditioning in reverse. Alignment is built when your inner world stops rejecting what your outer world is trying to offer. When you no longer feel like abundance would disrupt your identity, but confirm it. This takes time. Because identity does not shift through declarations, it shifts through lived consistency, through showing yourself repeatedly that it is safe to expand, that growth does not require self-betrayal, that receiving does not lead to collapse. You begin to act differently, not because you're chasing outcomes, but because your baseline has changed. You choose opportunities without apologizing. You price yourself without shrinking. You speak without rehearsing your exit. You rest without guilt. These are not strategies, they are signals. And the world responds to signals far more than statements. This is where abundance starts to feel less like a prize and more like a reflection. You notice that things no longer feel like battles. That effort meets cooperation more often than resistance. That support arrives in forms you didn't predict, not because life suddenly became generous, but because you stopped operating from contradiction. The most powerful realization lands quietly. Abundance was never withholding itself from you. It was waiting for you to stop arguing with it internally. Alignment does not mean certainty. It means congruence. You can be unsure and still aligned. You can be assured and still aligned. Alignment simply means your inner world is no longer saying no, while your outer actions say yes. And when that inner no dissolves, even gradually, something fundamental shifts. You stop feeling like you're chasing life. You stop feeling like you're behind. You stop measuring your worth by outcomes. You feel placed, grounded, ready. Not because you've proven yourself, but because you've stopped disqualifying yourself. This is the quiet thunder of alignment. The moment you understand that abundance does not need to be summoned, chased, or convinced. It needs to be matched. And matching is not about becoming someone else. It's about releasing the internal resistance that keeps you from standing fully in who you already are becoming. You were never meant to attract abundance like a stranger knocking on a locked door. You were meant to align with it, like a room finally rearranged to receive the light that was already waiting outside. And once the alignment is there, nothing has to be forced. It arrives, naturally, inevitably, because for the first time you are no longer in your own way. It doesn't arrive with noise. There is no announcement, no moment where the world stops and acknowledges what has shifted inside you. Awakening is quieter than you expected, so quiet that most people miss it entirely. They keep waiting for a feeling that feels like victory, when the truth is far more subtle. Awakening feels like certainty without urgency. For a long time, your life has been driven by pressure. Pressure to fix yourself. Pressure to catch up. Pressure to prove that you're not falling behind. Even your growth felt tense, like something you had to earn before time ran out. Analyzing and contemplating. Your greatest teacher will always mooning, but intensity burns fast. Certainty endures. You felt the exhaustion of trying to become someone, of chasing clarity, chasing confidence, chasing the version of yourself you thought would finally feel whole. And the more you chased, the more distant it felt, not because you weren't capable, but because awakening cannot be hunted. It cannot be forced into existence. It emerges when resistance ends. There comes a moment, often after disappointment, after surrender, after you've stopped demanding answers, when something inside you settles, not collapse, settles. The frantic inner dialogue quiets. The constant self-questioning loosens its grip. And in that space, a different kind of knowing takes root. Not excitement, not adrenaline. Certainty. You stop asking who you're supposed to be. You stop negotiating with your potential. You stop waiting for permission to take your own life seriously. And this doesn't happen because everything is suddenly clear. It happens because clarity is no longer required to move forward. This is the moment the old self doesn't argue anymore. The voice that once demanded reassurance grows quiet. The fear that once needed constant management loses its urgency. Not because it disappeared, but because it no longer runs the room. You don't need to defeat it, you simply stop obeying it. Awakening is not dramatic, it is decisive. You feel it when you no longer explain yourself internally, when you don't rehearse conversations before having them, when you don't need to justify rest, ambition, or boundaries. You move differently, not faster, not louder, but cleaner. With less friction. This is where true power lives. Most people associate awakening with inspiration, with sudden motivation or overwhelming clarity. But inspiration fades. Awakening remains. It shows up as a grounded presence, as an unshakable sense that you are no longer experimenting with who you are. You are inhabiting it. You stop romanticizing struggle. You stop needing hardship to feel legitimate. You stop confusing chaos with growth. And this shift doesn't make you passive. It makes you precise. You say no without guilt. You say yes without overthinking. You act without broadcasting. Because certainty doesn't need witnesses. There is a calm that replaces the old hunger, a steadiness that doesn't depend on results. You still want more, but you no longer feel empty without it. Desire becomes clean when it's no longer fueled by lack. This is the quiet thunder most people never hear. You realize that awakening didn't change your life overnight. It changed how you stand inside it. You no longer brace yourself against the future. You meet it. You don't cling to outcomes. You commit to direction. And direction, once chosen, simplifies everything. You stop asking if you're ready. You stop waiting for confidence to arrive. You stop needing the world to validate what you already know internally. You trust your own timing. You trust your own pace. You trust your own evolution. Not blindly, honestly. This trust is not arrogance. It is intimacy with yourself. It comes from watching yourself survive what you thought you couldn't, from honoring the ground you've already covered, from recognizing that you don't need to be finished to be aligned. Awakening is when the inner argument ends. No more fighting the past. No more feeding the future. No more negotiating your worth. You don't declare peace. You arrive at it. And from that place, your actions change. Not because you're trying to be disciplined, but because confusion is no longer draining your energy. You don't waste momentum second-guessing yourself. You don't fragment your focus chasing validation. Your life begins to feel intentional. This doesn't mean it's easy. It means it's clear. You still face uncertainty. You still encounter resistance. But now it doesn't shake your sense of self. You don't interpret obstacles as signs you're off track. You understand that difficulty is not disqualification. It's friction. And friction doesn't stop movement unless you let it. There is a gravity to you now. People feel it before they understand it. Not because you demand attention, but because you are no longer seeking it. Presence has weight, and certainty, when quiet, is undeniable. This is what awakening actually gives you. Not answers, but authority. Authority over your attention. Authority over your direction. Authority over your direction. Authority over the meaning you assign to your experiences. You stop living reactively. You stop letting moods dictate your identity. You stop outsourcing your sense of self to outcomes. And in this authority, something remarkable happens. Life begins to respond, not magically, naturally. You notice fewer internal obstacles, fewer emotional detours, less self-sabotage disguised as caution. You move with a kind of inevitability, not because success is guaranteed, but because receipt is no longer an option you entertain. This is not confidence. Confidence can waver. This is knowing, knowing that you will adjust, knowing that you will learn, knowing that you will earn, knowing that you will endure without losing yourself. Awakening is the moment you stop needing to be saved by circumstances, by people, by future versions of yourself. You are here now, present, grounded, awake, and the final realization arrives softly, without celebration. You were never asleep because you lacked awareness. You were asleep because you were waiting, waiting for permission, waiting for certainty, waiting for proof that you were allowed to trust yourself. Now you no longer wait. You move forward, not with urgency, but with resolve, not with noise, but with direction, not with desperation, but with quiet commitment. This is the end of seeking and the beginning of embodiment. Awakening is not loud, it is certain. And once it arrives, you do not announce it. You live from it, and nothing ever feels the same again.